Now that we're in the middle of the Russian summer offensive, I think it's a good time to do an update on the Ukraine situation. We're getting a lot of people now, both in the West and in Russia, saying we're heading to the end game. This could be the last phase of this war. This whole thing could be decided in 6 months. Again, maybe for the fourth or fifth time. But then again, this is Schrodinger's war. It's constantly almost over and on the verge of going on forever. Both sides are simultaneously winning or losing. A whole lot is happening and nothing's happening. But there have been a couple important events lately that I think we should go over and put them in kind of the context of at least how I have viewed the course of this war, and maybe why I hold the opinions I do about it. And to kind of make this fun, or just to better understand it, I've done what I often do. So we're going to go through the different phases, I think, of Ukraine's strategic defeat. It began like 2 years ago, and we've just kind of been moving in a steady direction. And as we're going to go through, I'm going to compare it to some historical examples so we can kind of get an idea, at least, where I think we are, where we were, and where we're going. So, in terms of the course of the war, I think the main turning point, probably the most important turning point, was the Ukrainian spring-summer-fall offensive. That was where they launched a huge offensive against fortified Russian lines and basically just got completely destroyed, took very minimal amounts of ground and immense casualties. I view this as resulting in a permanent loss of strategic initiative. We'll talk about it a bit more later, but I think that ends any realistic hope or even distant hope Ukraine had of actually decisively winning this war and completely kicking Russia out. The Ukrainian army, though, was still relatively strong after it, even if it was massively depleted, and that heads into the Battle of Avdiivka, wherein Ukraine lost its last strategic reserves. It still had some mechanized brigades, it still had some elite forces that were in reserve, that were decently rested and equipped, that they could throw in at certain ports in the line to try to plug gaps or to launch local counterattacks. Those were pretty much all expended during the Battle of Avdiivka, and after that, Ukraine had to rely on just pulling soldiers from the rest of the front lines. We had the Kursk incursion that ended a couple months back. Some people might say these two contradict each other. I don't consider the Kursk incursion to be a strategic move, but you're free to have your own opinion. I think that the impact of that was it massively accelerated the collapse of the Ukrainian army. I think whatever defensive strength they had left was just hugely hollowed out by the losses suffered in Kursk. And so at the moment we are in the Russian summer offensive, and I think we're in what I call a pre-operational collapse phase. Now, operational collapse is a little bit different than, I guess you could say, full-on military collapse. And that's partially so I can provide an ambiguous prediction, so regardless of what happens, I can claim I'm right. But seriously, how I'm defining operational collapse is the war isn't over, and there'll probably still be some fierce fighting, and it's not as if all the field forces of Ukraine will admit defeat and surrender, or won't continue to hold out maybe for months. But it'll be a point where the central command can no longer effectively coordinate forces at a national level. Logistics will have broken down, so regular supplies will either just stop altogether or they'll sporadically get a bit of stuff in. You might start getting a bit of an every man for himself mentality where local commanders increasingly ignore orders from the center. And once again, even if the war can go on for quite some time, any kind of central control or central strategic planning is basically gone at that point in time. So I think we're in the early phases of that. Now, the signs that I think that will show us that we have reached kind of operational collapse is when the last couple fortress cities collapse. There's still a couple left and they're falling quickly, or Russia reaches the Dnieper. particularly if Russia is closing in on the Dnieper and blows the bridges across it, preventing Ukraine from moving supplies over it, and more importantly, preventing their majority of the army that's on the East Bank from crossing over. And so my prediction, which will probably be wrong, is I think Ukraine will be in operational collapse by the fall. I had said that I thought it would happen by the end of the summer, depending on when Russia launched their big offensive. I will probably be wrong, but I don't know the signs. There's certain things that are happening now that I haven't really seen in the last couple times. So we'll take a look at it. I mean, that's the point of clickbait: is you just give a take that's normally wrong, and people who agree with you think it's brilliant. People who don't agree with you think that you're a hack. And if you're proven right, then you can go, look, I was right, and the doubters were wrong. And if you're proven wrong, you can obfuscate and pretend that the video never existed. So in other words, it's free content. Anyway, so we have the Ukraine spring, summer, fall offensive. So this was Ukraine's major offensive, for those of you who don't recall, that aimed to decisively defeat Russia and more or less end the war. They had put together like a large NATO-trained army. They had whole brigades that were trained on Leopard tanks and eventually Abrams and Bradleys, and they were trained in like Western NATO combined arms tactics despite not having any air support. And they put together basically all of their like strategic offensive capabilities in this one attack that came up against like 5 or 6 different lines of dug-in, heavily fortified Russian positions, and it was a complete and total disaster. They lost most of the just a huge number of soldiers, a huge amount of equipment, and I think it permanently crippled their ability to launch offensives. Like, I think post-spring offensive, they would not be able to do what they did in 2022, where they took back some territories that the Russian army had overextended themselves on. So I kind of view this as them permanently losing initiative. And this basically means for the rest of the war, they're just going to be reacting. There's not a real chance of defeating Russia. There's a chance of not losing and getting the other side to give you favorable terms. But there's no real path to victory, in that if you win a couple major battles against Russia, maybe you can shatter their confidence, maybe you can drive them out, maybe you can make Putin sue for peace. That, I think, became more or less impossible post the spring, summer, fall offensive. By that part in the war, they couldn't replace the loss of so many of their best trained, often Western trained divisions, and a lot of the modern equipment that they got from NATO. It just wasn't really replaceable. My understanding is the U.S. surged a lot of shells. Like, it went through a lot of its reserves. It got a whole bunch from South Korea, and they gave them those reserves. And now it's just kind of a trickle that they're getting in. So, some historical parallels. We have the Kursk offensive. Interestingly, the Kursk offensive is not the historical equivalent of the Kursk offensive. This was Germany's last major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front, Operation Citadel, where they fought a huge tank battle at Kursk, and they lost an immense amount of resources there, and they were basically just gradually falling back for the remainder of the war. It went on for another 2 years, but they just weren't capable of anything of that level again. You have the Gettysburg campaign, where Lee invaded the North. After the Gettysburg campaign, the South had taken such heavy casualties, and the front lines had moved to the point that Lee was never really able to invade the North again, and was on the defensive for the remainder of the war. You have Scipio Africanus, who, when Hannibal was kind of laying waste to Italy, he invaded Spain and destroyed a bunch of the Carthaginian colonies there, which forced the Senate in Carthage to recall Hannibal. And basically the Carthaginians were just kind of left cut off in North Africa, and it was really just kind of a matter of time when Rome would eventually come from them. We had the German Spring Offensive of World War I, where they committed their last strategic reserves and their temporary advantage from the Eastern Front and threw them into battle against the Allies. And they did okay for parts of it, but ultimately was a failure. And it left their army exhausted and in a position where they just couldn't feasibly win anymore. And then we have the Horns of Haddon, which was during the Crusades, where the Crusader kingdoms basically just got all their soldiers together and like marched out into the desert and got slaughtered. And that was basically the end of the Crusader kingdom's ability to launch offensives. Like the Crusades would go on for another 200 years or so, but it was mostly just defending and being reactive. So we then have the Battle of Avdiivka, which is one of the main battles in the fortress belt. Part of why this war has moved so slowly on a lot of fronts is the main fighting has been in Donbass, and Ukraine had built the fortress belt there, wherein they took a lot of these cities and just spent the last, or rather the years between the whole Crimea crisis and the start of the special military operation, and these are just completely fortified bunkers, trenches, reinforce the buildings. These are all Soviet era concrete, reinforced concrete monstrosities. And fighting your way through them is incredibly difficult. And artillery doesn't even really work because artillery doesn't do that much damage to commie blocks. It was only really when the Russians got glide bombs that they were able to start taking them out and making some progress. But kind of since the beginning, this has a lot of cases been the main front of the war. And kind of like with World War I, it's static. Like stuff is happening. A lot of people are dying. Perhaps most of the casualties are coming from there. But because it's not this big aero offensive, it's just kind of this brutal, monotonous street fighting. People don't really think about it in the same way. Now, as with Bakhmut, what Russia was able to achieve at Avdiivka was fire encirclement. I've also heard it called operational encirclement or a cauldron. So this is where they aren't able to actually surround the city completely. They're able to surround it on maybe 3 sides, and the side that is still open, that their opponent can still bring supplies in through, is under fire control or artillery control. So the Russian artillery and anti-tank missiles and all that kind of stuff can fire on reinforcements coming in, logistical supplies coming in from the main road. And sometimes it's preferable to not attempt to fully encircle the city so that your enemy will keep sending more and more reinforcements in. And obviously the rest of their soldiers are trapped in the city and they can't really launch an offensive. So you just kind of get into a siege situation where you just keep pummeling them in the city. You let them bring in more and more stuff. You shell the stuff as it's coming in. If people try to run, you kill them. And it just becomes this really bloody attritional warfare. So long after it was obvious this is what was happening, Zelensky and Zaluzhny declined to withdraw from Avdiivka. They decided that the city had to be held at all costs. And so even when the Russians started actively pushing a bit more to start taking the city, they threw in their last remaining strategic reserves. They just kept throwing them in. I remember towards the end of it, they were trying to launch like counterattacks in the area. I think like the 3rd Mechanized Brigade or the Azov guys got destroyed for like the 4th or 5th time this war as they got sent in and they're like, oh, you need to, I don't know, punch open a hole for the troops inside to get out. And eventually like they were allowed to withdraw, but it was after, I don't know, they were mostly encircled. The people who withdrew got horribly mauled by artillery fire and drones. A lot of people were just abandoned or left within Avdiivka, and it resulted in the loss of their final remaining strategic reserves. So after this, if Ukraine wanted to do anything, they can only really do it by taking forces off from somewhere else and rushing them to that location. And it becomes kind of like the Dutch boy with his finger in the dike, that you keep trying to fill the various holes and they just get worse and worse and worse. You can only plug so many at a time. So for historical equivalents, I did once again, the Spring Offensive. I shouldn't have put it in there. But we have the Ardennes Offensive, aka the Battle of the Bulge, where Germany committed its last strategic reserves in kind of a desperate throw of the dice on the Western Front. And while they had lost the strategic initiative long ago, kind of their last real decent mobile forces were taken out. We have Operation Ishigo, which is if I ever get the chance, I kind of want to do a video on Operation Ichigo. So this was done towards the end of World War II, where Japan launched an overland clearing operation to try to capture a railway between northern and southern China, so they could ship goods from the South Pacific back to Japan without having to use sea lanes. And it was kind of a brief victory, but they succeeded in basically destroying what was left of the Nationalist Forces Professional Army. And they were left just kind of in a complete almost coma for the remainder of the Sino-Japanese War. And when the war ended, they were really a shadow of their former selves. We have the Battle of Leipzig, where Napoleon basically lost all of his remaining reserves and his remaining large field army. And after that, he was kind of just working with scraps. We have the Battle of Asculum, one of the battles that is used to describe the concept of the Pyrrhic victory, where King Pyrrhus won, but at the cost of his reserves and the casualties he took, he could not make good on, so he had to abandon that portion of his invasion of Rome. And then we have the Imogen War, which was the Japanese invasion of Korea, and this was the battle where the entire Japanese fleet got wiped out, and it just was kind of a stalemate. So, is there a difference between this and this? Maybe not a ton. It's just kind of different phases of the same thing. It's just kind of like bad, worse, awful. So we have the Kursk incursion that was seen as a huge success. This took place from mid last year to early this year. So it's important to note for the Kursk incursion, this was not done with reserves. They had to just pull people from all across the front line. Tens of thousands of people who were holding other areas were sent up to Kursk. And they invaded Russia, and a lot of people said, well, this is awesome. They invaded Russia. They took territory. This was a strategic offensive. I don't really think so. To me, this would be like if Canada and America went to war, and Canada got like 10,000 guys and invaded Montana, where there was no American units stationed, and they captured a bunch of Montana, and then they said, look, we won. We strategically captured part of the U.S. Or maybe they invaded Alaska and they grabbed a bunch of territory in Alaska or something like that. It's maybe not quite that degree, but Kursk is really rural. They made it about 30 kilometers in, and it became this really unwieldy salient. And the only real major settlement, if you can use that term, they managed to capture was Suja at a massive 6,000 people. So this was like a 6-month-long disaster. More or less, the Russians were just kind of very laid back about this, wherein they just basically, the Ukrainian forces got bogged down. They reached the end of their logistics, and the Russians just kept firing artillery and missiles at them. And they were far away from the logistical lines. They had no air defense. They hadn't built the defenses and other kind of things that they had back in their territory. So the Russians basically just kept pounding them, and I've heard estimates tens of thousands of Ukrainians died. I don't know how many actually died during this, but it did a number on their defenses all across the front line. Russia's final offensive encircled or overran a whole bunch of Ukrainian soldiers. They lost all kinds of equipment, and none of this stuff are things that they could actually replace. So some historical parallels of where the situation was bad, but a costly decision made things worse. We had the Athens Sicilian expedition, which, if I recall, during the Peloponnesian War, Athens did this weird side quest where they went to try to fight in Syracuse, and it was a debacle. It took up all kinds of money and manpower and fleet, and it put them at a disadvantage against Sparta. We have Operation Spring Awakening, which was the last German offensive of World War II, wherein they tried to retake Budapest, and it didn't really work out. We have the KMT moving forces to Manchuria after Japan surrendered. They got the U.S. to airlift like a whole bunch of divisions to Manchuria, which was not. I'm not even sure if it was really connected effectively to nationalist territory. So when the Civil War restarted, that area was quickly cut off and they couldn't resupply it. And that was just a massive waste. It was a massive overextension. We have the Battle of Ben Mi Phaut, if that's how you pronounce it. That was during the the spring offensive in the Vietnam War. There's a lot of spring offensives that end wars. When the South Vietnamese government had decided that they were going to withdraw from the highlands, and it was just a complete and total debacle. And it just led to their army in the area getting destroyed when they were doing relatively okay by Vietnam War standards. We have Manzikert, the attempt to retake Anatolia, which failed and destroyed the Byzantines' capacity to field a field army. You had Japan's bizarre adventure invading Burma and the logistical disaster that was. And then we have France deciding to invade Egypt. So maybe some of these are a bit of a stretch, but just saying it is. I was trying to come up with some examples of just side projects, or maybe not even side projects in the case of Manzikert, but just things that made a bad situation worse without really achieving anything. So we are now at the Russian summer offensive. So Russia's been building up for the last couple of years, getting huge amounts of artillery, missiles, tanks, glide bombs, drones, all that kind of stuff. And they've launched kind of a general offensive all across the front lines. I think basically everywhere they're pushing forward now. America just announced again that they're suspending certain types of aid to Ukraine, not even because Trump doesn't want to give it, but because they're out. Ukraine's largely out of air defense missiles. They're out of armored vehicles. Just basically out of just about everything. It was only a trickle that was coming in at any rate. It sounds like America can't even provide that. Besides that, Israel's in trouble, and every single piece of military equipment that could possibly go to Israel has to go to Israel, even if it means abandoning Project Ukraine. So once again, this is the lava flow. This is the bulldozers, I like to put it. This kind of slow but steady, just surging forward, taking town after town. It's gradually increasing in speed. So I think Ukraine is in pre or early operational collapse at this point in time. There's still some ability to coordinate on a national level. Like Sersky and Zelensky's authority hasn't completely gone. And there still are somewhat functional supply chains. But I think it's just going to get worse and worse and worse, basically by the day at this point. So Russia's faced with either just continuing as they are, or bringing in their reserve armies and trying to force a collapse just by shock or by breakthroughs or something like that. We'll see how that goes. I do think that Russia has the capacity at this point to cause an operational collapse. They just are going to have to. So just some historical examples. These are cases in which the war continued for a while afterwards. And the campaign went on for quite some time in some cases. But one side just gradually collapsed into the point where it was largely just kind of local units fighting without any kind of direct support from central command. So we had the Spring Offensive, which we covered. We had the 100-Day Offensive in World War I that saw just the gradual Oh, I put World War II there. But saw the gradual erosion of Germany's remaining fighting capacity and just them getting pushed back from their positions. We had the French campaign of 1814, post Leipzig, where Napoleon was just desperately trying to defend France. And the war went on still for months, and Napoleon won some tactical victories, but he was so severely outnumbered by that point in time. It was just basically moving around the deck chairs on the Titanic. We had Sherman's March to the Sea, which destroyed the Confederacy, but still some of its field armies continued fighting for months afterwards. A lot of the Chinese dynasties took like over a decade to implode, and they were often left just holding the area around the capital. And then we have the Boshin War in Japan. So the last phase of this will be a operational collapse, which I think is going to start in the fall. September might be a little bit aggressive in terms of it, but I don't really know. Things seem to be moving pretty quick at the moment. And like I said, this will not necessarily end the war or the fighting. There still might be some rather brutal urban fighting left, but the ability as central command to exercise authority over the remaining soldiers in the field will largely cease. Recruitment's going to break down, resupply is going to break down. You'll start seeing more and more surrenders, mutinies and stuff like that. But units will probably still hold certain cities, particularly the ideologically motivated ones, until they're completely out of supplies or destroyed. Whatever remains of Ukraine's Central Army will probably withdraw across the Dnieper or try to hold Kiev. And as I said earlier, the main signs that we've reached operational collapse will be when Russia decides to blow up the bridges across the Dnieper to prevent the Ukrainian army from escaping, or when the last of the fortress cities fall. So some examples I had of operational collapse. This is when there ceased to really be an effective central command, but fighting continued. Probably the best example is the last months of World War II for Germany. Some of the most brutal fighting happened towards the end of the war. Battle of Berlin, for instance. Despite the fact that Germany had been invaded on multiple fronts and basically everything had broken down, a lot of the units continued to fight on very bravely and inflict huge casualties, even as like the army was not really functioning as a coherent unit anymore. We had the White Russian forces who continued to fight in different parts of Russia, even after Kolchak died, and the hope of any kind of actual victory in the war as a whole had faded. We have ISIS that continues to fight in various locations despite losing its main territory in Syria. Pancho Villa continued to fight. The Qing during the Taiping Rebellion, I think, is another good example, where they basically operationally collapsed. Their armies were just no longer functional. They were no longer really able of putting up any effective resistance to the Taiping. Ultimately, it was local mandarins who had to raise their own armies that defeated the Taiping. But the Qing state largely collapsed during, well, not the state, but their army just kind of completely collapsed. And then we have like the last phases of the Iran-Iraq war, where both sides were basically at operational collapse. And it was just like Iraq managed to get, like, Iraq had basically just gotten completely destroyed at that point in time. And they managed to pull together just enough to launch a counteroffensive and kick Iran out. And then both sides came to a ceasefire. But they were both basically just kind of incapable of fighting further. And then the final phases of the 30 Years' War also was like that, in which both sides were just completely out of supplies, and they were incapable of really doing any kind of strategic movements against each other. So, in conclusion, Russia needs to decide what its endgame is, or whatever the final terms it will impose on Ukraine. The Ukrainian elite are basically 100% united on fighting until the bitter end, and there will be no negotiations on any terms. So, as I've said, you have the pro-war faction that Zelensky leads, you have the dissident pro-war faction, which is like Poroshenko, and you have the ultra-nationalists. All of them are 100% committed to fighting till the destruction of Ukraine. And rather than give up like 1 inch of territory to Russia, they would rather the entire state be destroyed. So Russia's not going to come to a negotiated treaty. So they're basically just going to have to figure out what they're going to do once the Ukrainian government collapses. So how much are they going to annex? How much are they going to occupy? Are they going to set up a satellite state? I don't really know, and I think that's one of the reasons this war has dragged on, is they haven't really been able to decide on an overall strategic political objective. I don't know if this is because Putin is like trying to negotiate, or he's trying to respect international rule of law or something, or he's just unsure. But I just kind of find that like it's still we're going to take the couple territories, the 4 regions in Crimea, and the whole thing though is still just like denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. So I think this is the main, like, also this could be the reason why the summer offensive isn't going faster, because they don't even really know what its objective is or what it's supposed to achieve. Like I said, I don't know an exact timeline. As I said, I think they'll be probably in operational collapse by September, and I'll probably be proven wrong on that. But I think they're definitely in the early stages of it, and we'll see what happens. Particularly if whatever the Western supplies they pause don't restart, that is not a good place to be. And you are starting to see panic from Zelensky and from the Europeans, and even from some of the people who have been the most ardent supporters of Ukraine, who have just kind of denied reality this whole time. So that's the video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting. As always, more exciting content to come. God bless, and I'll talk to you all real soon.